During the season, we will do a weekly fantasy bonus episode as part of our Locked On Seahawks lineup. We will keep you updated weekly on the grind of the fantasy season. Today, it's about the draft in the first ever Fantasy Friday episode of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12s. I am your host for this Fantasy Friday, the first Fantasy Friday episode here on Locked On Seahawks. Nick Lee here. You can follow me at NickLee51 on Twitter. I will be the main host of these episodes throughout the season with various guests and co-hosts along the way. Going at it solo for today. That's all right. This episode is brought to you by Dave. Hindsight is 20/20, and you can't change the past. But what if you could get a little help from your future self? Maybe you'd ask to borrow a little cash. Now you can with Dave. Dave is the banking app that can help you get up to $500 instantly with extra cash. That's more money to fill your tank, buy a wedding gift, or to catch up on bills. You can finally tackle those expenses that have been stressing you out without any hangups. There's no interest and no credit check needed. Millions of people have already downloaded the Dave app to get the financial relief they need with the extra cash. Download the Dave app from the App Store right now. That's Dave, D-A-V-E. Sign up for an extra cash account and get up to $500 instantly. For terms and conditions, go to dave.com/legal. Instant transfer fees apply at banking provided by Evolve, member FDIC. Future you will thank you. Kicking off our first Locked On Seahawks bonus Fantasy Friday episode, I first want to do a disclaimer. My disclaimer is that there are so many moving parts and variables to every single player, every single game. What I want to do here is play percentages, play odds. What are the likeliest scenarios? We all watch football. We know that anything can happen any given Sunday. Guys get hurt, unfortunately. Others rise to the occasion because of those injuries or otherwise. We're going to do our best here on these Fantasy Friday episodes to set yourself up for success and build a strong foundation. And maybe, I have a friend who is relying on me for fantasy advice, which is a pretty big burden. And he's more of a novice. And he says, just get me to the point where I don't embarrass myself on the office pool of fantasy. And that's kind of my goal here, is to help you do that, especially if you're new. And we're also going to keep this, Seahawks themed as well. So it's not a perfect science. There's an innumerable variables that come with a fantasy season. It's gambling. It's a chance. It's a bet. So we'll see. When the season starts, we'll do a little bit more of the start 'em or sit 'em, waiver wire kind of things. And also keep it Seahawks involved, keeping in mind the Seahawks and the team they're playing, just to keep it kind of Seahawks themed and with their opponent each week. This week, as the season hasn't started yet, we're going to focus on the draft, building a strong foundation with your fantasy team, and keep a more draft theme episode. So the first segment here, we'll go over some draft strategies, and then the second segment, we'll go into more Seahawks specific and maybe which Seahawks players to draft in your fantasy league and when. So without further ado, let's dive into it. So first, I'm going to talk about which league I'm going to do kind of the preview for. And I'm going to focus more on the leagues where it's the slots are 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, 1 tight end, and a flex or 2. My league I'm playing right now is a league actually with my brother-in-law in Wales. It's a Yahoo league. My brother-in-law in Wales, yes, the country Wales, runs this like 5-conference, 12-team per conference, mega 72-team fantasy league. It's like Excel spreadsheets, weekly newsletters, the whole bit. It's really fun. A lot of pressure, but really fun. So I'm going to stick with the leagues I'm more familiar with. So in that league specifically, I have 2 running back slots, 2 wide receiver slots, a tight end slot, and 2 flex slots. So flex meaning a wide receiver, running back, or tight end. Any of those 3 can be fit into those slots. So obviously draft strategies, it depends on where you're drafting, when and where. Now, if you're lucky enough to be picking first overall in your fantasy draft, congratulations, you have Jonathan Taylor. Please pick Jonathan Taylor first overall if you have that honor, that distinction. He's the number 1 fantasy projected player this season by a large margin, in fact. And last year, he finished second overall in fantasy points to Cooper Kupp, the reigning fantasy king, who himself should be drafted pretty early. But I would argue that maybe there's a slight regression there, especially with some uncertainty with Matt Stafford. and just, the overall Super Bowl hangover for the Rams, I would lean towards Jonathan Taylor. Number one overall. I think that's pretty cut and dry. And if you're number two, Christian McCaffrey. I know some people kind of want to wipe their hands of him with his injury history, but when he is healthy, he is consistently the best fantasy player out there. So I know that's a big caveat, when healthy. That's a lot of fantasy, is when and if guys are healthy. So Christian McCaffrey, I think, would still be worth the number two pick. And if those top two running backs are gone, and then you can maybe think about the Cooper Kupps, but still, even then, I just want to go straight up. Prioritize running backs. Running backs, the list of running backs that are elite fantasy running backs is not as deep as it is at wide receiver. So it's a bit more top heavy. So prioritize running backs in the first couple rounds, because with wide receivers, obviously, naturally, there's more wide receivers on the field at a time than there are running backs. More opportunities for points. So Jonathan Taylor, number one overall, easily. I'd say that even the top five, Jonathan Taylor, Christian McCaffrey, Austin Eckler, I think is going to be an excellent fantasy player. Derrick Henry, of course, the injury a little bit scares me from last year, and the usage. Dalvin Cook, always a big threat. And a guy I want to highlight as well, going down the line here, is let me start with this. You want to have a bell cow running back. You don't want to draft a running back, especially in the first couple rounds, that is not a bell cow, not a workhorse RB1. You don't want a guy that's in a fantasy or a running back by committee. Just don't do it. Stay away from those guys the first few rounds. Now, talking PPR versus non-PPR, if you've heard that phrase, you're unfamiliar with it. PPR is point per reception. Some fantasy leagues award points to your fantasy team based on per reception. So a player catches a pass, there's a point. Some are half points, some are whole points, and some don't reward that at all. It depends on the league you play. The league I play in, like I mentioned, my Welsh Yahoo Fantasy League, awards half a point per reception. So mine is technically a PPR league. So if you're not in a PPR league, if you're in a league that does not award points for receptions, I would especially focus on your first three rounds, get two elite running backs, because then receiver kind of gets a little bit less valuable with not being points for receptions. So especially in a non-PPR league, prioritize two elite bell cow RB1 type running backs. And then of course, receiver is still very valuable. So make sure to get a third receiver. And basically my theme is your first three picks, two running backs, wide receiver. However you want to mix that in. If you really feel strongly about Cooper Kupp, Justin Jefferson, Stephon Diggs, those are kind of receivers. If any you miss out on the top couple of running backs, go ahead. But make sure your next two rounds are starting elite running backs. You don't want to miss out. If you are in a PPR league like me, think about running backs that also rack up the catches, that are involved in the passing game. Najee Harris out of Pittsburgh led all of running backs last year, which is very impressive. As a rookie, I believe he was a rookie, with 74 catches last year, which would have led some of the NFL teams in receptions, period, regardless of running back, receiver, tight end. Pretty impressive, 74 catches. Austin Eckler from the Chargers just below him at 70. So those two running backs notched the 70 catch plateau as running backs. So if you were in a PPR, a point per reception league, I would advise you to prioritize guys like that. Guys that are going to be heavily involved in the offense, regardless of its pass or run. So Najee Harris, Austin Eckler are big in that scenario. Another guy that isn't necessarily top 10 lists or top 5 lists to watch out for, even maybe late round 1, early round 2, Aaron Jones from Green Bay. Aaron Rodgers lost his favorite, security blanket favorite toy, Davante Adams, who is now in Las Vegas. And I think he's going to rely heavily on Aaron Jones. Aaron Jones is a proven commodity on that Green Bay offense. Not a lot of proven commodities now for Aaron Rodgers to throw to and to hand off to. So Aaron Jones is going to get a plethora of touches, be it on the run or the pass. So late first round, early second round, I would suggest Aaron Jones give Aaron Jones a look, because he's going to get plenty of action in Green Bay. Now, before the first 3 rounds end, I really want to and I'm not telling you what to do. I'm not saying I'm the guru, but in my opinion, this is what I would do. I'm going to start to phrase it that way. Before the 3rd round ends, I want to make sure I have 2 elite starting bell cow, high volume, high touch volume running backs. and a top receiver. Now, Corbin and I on the Locked On Seahawks podcast maybe a month or so ago, we're talking about the top 10 lists. And the top 10 lists for receiver and the top 10 lists for running backs, receivers are stacked. This receiver group is stacked this year, much more so than running backs. So you prioritize diving into that depth at running back first, making sure to get some of those top-heavy running backs before you think about receivers. So after 3 rounds, however you want to do it, I advise 2 running backs a receiver, just to establish that strong foundation. And as far as wide receivers, of course, we have the Cooper Kupp, who's the reigning fantasy king. Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, Devontae Adams in Las Vegas now, and Stephon Diggs in Buffalo, I think are the top 5. You can throw CeeDee Lamb in there. Deebo Samuel, just with his usage at San Francisco, is going to get plenty of hype. I am worried about Tyreek Hill, just in Miami. Obviously, going from Patrick Mahomes to Tua Tagovailoa, a little bit of a drop-off there, even though he's insistent on social media. He's backing up his quarterback. I can't fault him for that. So Keenan Allen, I think I would personally maybe pick Keenan Allen over Tyreek Hill. In this rankings I'm looking at here on ESPN, Tyreek Hill is actually ranked ahead of Keenan Allen. I think Keenan Allen should be ahead. So before the end of round 4, you should have 2 elite running backs, at least 1 elite receiver. And then that 4th one's kind of a wild card between elite receiver, or if you have an opportunity, if you have an opportunity to draft one of the elite tight ends in the league, that being Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, or Kyle Pitts. I think those are the 3 that'll set you apart. Now, don't sleep on George Kittle, but there's a precarious situation at quarterback in San Francisco. Trey Lance, unproven. So otherwise, George Kittle absolutely on that list, but I think he more falls victim to the uncertainty at quarterback in San Francisco. Darren Waller in Las Vegas, also a fine tight end. But in round 4, 2 running backs, get that receiver, and then either in round 4 a second elite receiver or one of the top 3 tight ends in Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews, and Kyle Pitts. But certainly after 4 rounds, and I know that late in round 4, you're going to get a little trigger happy with quarterbacks. You're going to want to notch that guy. Obviously, you don't want to wait too long, but I want you to resist. I think it's okay to feel natural about getting a quarterback in there, but hold your fire until round 5 for quarterbacks. Josh Allen, Lamar Jackson, and Patrick Mahomes, I think, are the clear 3 top quarterbacks in fantasy. But before you start thinking about quarterbacks, I really want you and me, when I do my draft later in a week or so, to have a solid foundation of 4 flex players, whether that's 2 running backs, 2 wide receivers, the 2 starters, or 2 elite running backs, a wide receiver, and elite tight end. Get those 4. That's a core 4. You want a core 4, a foundation around the quarterback you're going to draft. That'll really what will make or break your fantasy. So what will make or break your fantasy season, in my opinion, is not the quarterback you draft. It is your depth at, especially running back, but depth at the flex positions, running back, receiver, tight end. That will make or break your tight end. I tried a different strategy last year, full disclosure. I drafted Aaron Rodgers in the 3rd round last year just to see, what would happen. I tanked. I was a terrible, terrible fantasy. My running backs dropped like flies. I had 0 depth. It was terrible. My worst fantasy season I ever had. I've been playing fantasy football for about 15 years. That was my worst one. So I don't advise taking that kind of strategy. And so round 5, 2 running backs, 2 elite wide receivers, and or receiver tight end. And then I would go maybe one of the elite quarterbacks. But by after 5 picks, either have one of those top 3 quarterbacks or double down on depth at running back or tight end or wide receiver. So, and with those quarterbacks, it's not as imperative to get a top 4 or 5 quarterback in fantasy. It's just not. It's not going to make or break you. If you don't get Josh Allen, Mahomes, Lamar Jackson, Justin Herbert, it's not going to really kill you. Obviously, in the real life NFL, wins and losses, that will matter. But in fantasy, it's a totally different game. Guys like Kyler Murray, even Jalen Hurts in Philly are going to put up numbers. Tom Brady, of course, is going to be good for some good fantasy numbers. Dak Prescott, Joe Burrow, those guys can still lead you to victory on your fantasy season. So it's going to make your depth at wide receiver and running back will make or break your fantasy team more so than the quarterback that you pick or don't pick. So after 6 rounds, you should have 2 legit starting running backs, an elite wide receiver, and preferably another one for 4, and then another tight end, and then the quarterback. I think that would be the route I would go for the first 6. And at that point, that's a solid foundation. I'm not going to tell you how to pick, pick for pick all the way down to round 14. But I think that's a really, really good, solid foundation. Best player available from there on in. Rounds 7 through 14, best player available. Make sure you fill in on depth there. And then a few tricks to end here the first segment. If you're new, beware of bye weeks. Beware of drafting players with the same bye week. You don't want to have a bye week where you have like half your team out. So be wary of who has what bye week when you're starting to draft. Ignore it for the first couple because you want the elite guys. But once you get into like your third, fourth running back, third, fourth receiver, second, third tight end, be wary that you're not doubling up on bye weeks. It's okay to double up, but don't triple up, So just be wary of that. And on defense, people want to draft the elite proven defenses over and over again. I would stay away from that. I actually would draft a defense in the last couple rounds. I don't think I would go earlier than that because really with defenses, it's about matchups. I would look for favorable early matchups in the season for defenses. Maybe the defense that's playing the Jets, the Giants, the Seahawks, unfortunately, the teams that are going to be playing multiple bad offenses, I think are good bets, even if they're somewhat mediocre defenses, or that's what the perception is. I think that's where you go to draft a defense, but do not reach. I would rather you add depth to your flex positions, that your running backs, receivers, tight ends, than reach for a defense or special teams. I just don't think that that's a good idea. You're better served adding to your depth there in your flex positions. And then kickers as well. They're unpredictable. I'd say wait to the last round. Pick one that has that either plays in a dome or plays on a good defense, or good offense, where they're going to have opportunities for field goal attempts and extra points. Obviously, there's a couple elite guys out there, but I wouldn't obsess over that. Also, maybe not going to make or break your fantasy season. So again, solid foundation there. Prioritize running backs and don't sweat over getting the top 2 or 3 quarterbacks. Build depth under those in your flex positions. Coming up in our second segment, I dive a bit more into the Seahawks specifically when it comes to the fantasy draft. Don't go anywhere. You're listening to the Fantasy Friday episode of Locked On Seahawks. Life can be full of challenges. Recently, my family has undergone significant strife with family members dealing with debilitating health issues, including cancer. It's been a struggle for me, coping with it mentally. Life can be full of twists and turns, so it's important to show yourself through it all. BetterHelp Online Therapy will assess your needs and can match you with your own licensed professional therapist in less than 48 hours. Therapy worked wonders for me, but don't just take my word for it. Having someone in your corner to guide you when you're struggling to navigate obstacles can be invaluable. It's not a crisis line. It's not a self-help. It's professional therapy done securely online, available to people worldwide. With therapy, it can take a few tries to find the right fit for you. BetterHelp is a great way to invest in yourself. BetterHelp has a special offer to our listeners. Get 10% off your first month at betterhelp.com/lockedon. That's 10% off your first month of online therapy at betterhelp.com/lockedon. Welcome back, 12s. I'm your host for this Fantasy Friday episode. I'm Nick Lee. If you're listening to this, you're likely a Seahawks fan, and you're going to want to draft a Seahawk player or two just for fun, because you're a Hawk fan, and that's a natural feeling. It's okay. So the questions are, who should you draft and when? The top 3 fantasy players on the Seahawks are Tyler Lockett, DK Metcalf, and Rashad Penny. Not necessarily in that order, but those are the 3 I think that are draftable Seahawks players. And when you hear the acronym ADP, that is average draft position. I'm going to refer to that a few times here. Obviously, that there's a tenuous situation at quarterback in Seattle, and that will directly affect these 3 draft picks, or these 3 potential fantasy draft picks. And another interesting conundrum, maybe do you draft DK Metcalf or Tyler Lockett, depending on who you prefer, and if you're faced with that scenario, who do you pick between the 2? DK Metcalf's ADP, average draft position, per Fantasy Pros is 48, which in a 12-team league is right around right at the end of round 4, beginning of round 5. So, and Lockett is 92. So over 40 picks later at a mid-7th round pick or so. So the Fantasy Pros clearly think DK Metcalf is a superior fantasy player this year, or will be, compared to Tyler Lockett. However, Tyler Lockett technically had 11 more fantasy points last year in the Yahoo PPR league that I'm part of than Metcalf last year. And again, I don't have to rehash this for you. The Seahawks quarterback situation was a bit interesting last year. DK Metcalf seemed to do a lot better without Russell Wilson. and Tyler Lockett seemed to thrive with Russell Wilson and maybe disappeared otherwise. So, of course, this year the Seahawks are not going to have Russell Wilson. Shocking if you're living under a rock. Tyler Lockett last year averaged just 9 fantasy points per game last year without Russell Wilson. DK Metcalf averaged 15.9 fantasy points per game without Russell Wilson. So a significant difference. So it says go Metcalf if you have to pick between the two. I would not pick either one before the end of round 4, start of round 5. Personally, I would definitely wait till round 5 to think about drafting one of these two guys, including Metcalf. Get an elite wide receiver, get 2 elite wide receivers before you draft Metcalf. And again, this is not an indictment on his talent, on his ability. It is an indictment on his offensive situation. It's a lot to do with the quarterback situation. Plenty of elite, talented receivers don't have the support system around them to really elevate their fantasy game. Metcalf, I think, this year is one of those. And don't choose DK Metcalf in round 5 in place of an elite quarterback. I think you should go with an elite quarterback first. Then there's Rashad Penny, the running back. Average draft position at 82, which is around the late round 6. CBS has him ranked as the number 29 running back. Fantasy Pros have him at 28. Yahoo has him at 26th. So there's going to be some good value, I think, in drafting Penny. I think we all can agree that Rashad Penny is going to get the bulk of the carries, especially with Ken Walker's the third's injury. He's going to get the bulk of the carries, certainly early on. Of course, health willing. That's always the big thing with Rashad Penny. They're going to lean on that run game. They are. They're disastrously mediocre at quarterback. They have a young offensive line who I think might excel better at run blocking than pass blocking early on. And so I think Rashad Penny is a good value pick. I would say stash him in the 7th, 8th round. If Rashad Penny's still on the board, late 7th, 8th round, that's a good depth opportunity to add to your depth, to your flex positions at running back. Rashad Penny, I think, is a great asset there. I would not pick him as the top 2 running back just with your starting 2 running back slots, just with the injury history and the Seahawks, tentative situation on offense. He probably will put up some big numbers in some games, but I think he's an excellent flex or depth piece at running back. So my advice overall, don't touch a Seahawks player in the first 4 rounds. Just don't do it. They have a very young offensive line. Quarterback room is a mess. If I were to have a safe bet among the 3, I would be Rashad Penny. I think they really are going to rely heavily on the run game. But again, not until 7th, 8th, 9th round. Stash him in there as a good depth. And then what about the Seahawks defense? Yahoo has them as ranked as the 3rd worst fantasy defense ahead of this year, which I think is a little harsh. With some of the pass rushing tools they have, Darrell Taylor, I think, primed for a big year. You got Quandre Diggs and Jamal Adams, hopefully healthy. And I think the cornerback position is better than some people think. I think the tackling, of course, is going to be a big issue. But I don't think they're going to be the 3rd worst defense in the league fantasy-wise. I think that's a little harsh. But I would not draft them. As I said before, draft defenses late in the draft, and keep in mind the optimal, favorable offenses that they're going to play, the matchups. It's all about matchups with defense and special teams. So maybe snag them on the waiver wire middle of the season if they're looking like they're making a rebound against a poor offensive opponent, maybe the Falcons in week 3, maybe the Giants in week 8 at home. I think those are good matchups. If your defense is struggling, switch them out and see what the Seahawks can drum up. But overall, I would stay very clear of the Seahawks defense. Let them go undrafted for now. Let someone else reach for them. And if someone picks them, I'm hoping, of course, that they rebound and they have a good season. But I'm a believer that you don't reach for a defense. Add depth to your whole team, your flex positions first, and then go for defense in the last couple rounds. So Seahawks, I think that they're an undraftable defense right now, but that can change with some favorable matchups and playing above their expectations. You can follow me at NickLee51 on Twitter. Be sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks and give us a like, review wherever and however you listen. Locked On Apple Podcasts, YouTube, Spotify, however you listen. We appreciate the love. We have actually seen some big success the last few months, or last month, and it's all thanks to you 12s. We love you guys. Thank you very much. Until next time, go Hawks.